Back in the day, we were taught that Mungo Park discovered River Niger and Mary Cecil stopped the killing of twins in Calabar. There wasn't really much taught in history classes at the time. That was before the subject was struck out of the education curriculum for a whole 13 years. Though it's finally been reinstated as of the 24th of November 2022, and about 3,700 teachers are said to be in training in that regard. Something we have in common as Africans, which has also contributed greatly to the issues in the continent, is our search for identity. The question I've often asked myself is, how do you know who you are when you do not know where you came from? I may not know so much about our history as a people, but I have read books that talked about ancient kingdoms in Africa. These kingdoms were said to have existed centuries before the ancient kingdoms in Egypt. So my question is, what happened to these histories? Why are the stories not told, like that of the famous lost city of Machu Picchu and other lost cities in South America? In the course of my research, I came across a book titled The Encyclopedia of African History. Listen to this. African history as a modern academic discipline came of age in the 1950s. The decade of African nationalism that saw the parallel emergence of African institutions of higher education on the continent. The true origins of African higher education can be traced back many centuries to the Islamic universities of North Africa, Timbuktu and Cairo. While the origins of recorded history itself are to be found in the scrolls of ancient Egypt, probably the oldest recorded history in the world. Beyond the reaches of the Roman Empire in North Africa, the tradition of keeping written records of events, ideas, and dynasties was followed almost continuously by the priests and scholars of ancient, medieval, and modern Ethiopia. Meanwhile, pre-literate African societies recorded their histories in the oral memories and ancestral traditions that were faithfully handed down from generation to generation. Sometimes these were adapted to suit the political imperatives of current ruling elites. But as the modern academic historian knows only too well, the written record is similarly vulnerable to the interpretation of the recorder. Before the Ethiopian incursion at the end of the 19th century, literate Africans in Western and Southern Africa had appreciated the importance of recording oral traditions and writing the history of their own people. Following the colonial intrusion, however, Europeans took over the writing of African history and interpreted it primarily as a timeless backdrop to their own appearance on the scene. They brought with them not only the social dynamism of the imperial project, but also the perspective of their own historical traditions. Thus, early colonial historians saw an African of warring tribes, peopled by waves of migration, such as Roman imperialists had seen and conquered in Western Europe some 2,000 years earlier. To these historians, African peoples had no history of significance and were distinguished only by a variety of custom and tradition. Any contrary evidence of indigenous sophistication and development was interpreted as the work of outside, by implication, northern erosion, immigration, or influence. The origins of Great Zimbabwe, a Shona kingdom founded between 1100 and 1450, originally believed by European colonial historians to be non-African despite much evidence to the contrary, proved to be the most notorious and persistent of these myths. Despite early academic challenges, these European constructed myths about Africans' past exacted a dominant influence on approaches to African history until well into the second half of the 20th century. Encouraged and supported by a handful of European and Northern American academics, pioneering Africans seized the opportunities offered by the newly open academic world that emerged after World War II. So began the mature study of African history, which established the subject as a modern, respected academic discipline. Now, my thoughts. The fact that the African people's history was considered insignificant, and so the African people were only distinguished by a variety of customs and traditions, altered the history of the African people, because so much history, either written or oral, were lost during the period when Europeans recorded the African history with their interpretation. These constructed myths, which I'm sure most of us are well aware of, about Africans' past exerted not only a dominant influence on approaches to African history, but also to her identity as a people. I'm not saying knowing the genesis of anything automatically fixes whatever problem that has risen over the course of time. However, it does put things in perspective, giving the viewer more information to work with. I was really disappointed when I began learning about some of these histories well into my adult life. And I'm yet to understand why these histories are not part of our education curriculum in Nigerian schools. We were not even taught about the slave trade, nor the amalgamation of Nigeria. Instead, we were taught about how Mungo Park discovered River Niger. We will dive into identity crisis as Africans in the future.